So I've just set us on. So welcome to the second in our spring faculty scholarship series for the academic year 2020-2021. Where did the century go already? Which is apt because I'm happy to introduce Amy Nusbaum, who's going to be talking to us about open resources for classes. She's going to even tell us the right title. But so it's a very 21st century topic. So let's give Amy a round of applause and she'll tell us more about what's going to happen today.
Yay. Okay, just a few quick things. One, I appreciate your patience in advance. If my small human or my large dog interrupt at any time, we may need a quick intermission because it's COVID and it's 2021. The other thing is I have asked Mary and she has so graciously agreed to watch the chat for me because my brain doesn't like it when I try and present and watch that chat. So please feel free to leave comments or questions. And if Mary feels that they need to be like timed while I'm speaking, she's going to interrupt me and that's perfectly fine. But that's sort of how we're gonna go. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, and I put captions on. Okay, awesome. So I am here to talk open education and heritage, how free textbooks and innovative assignments can empower our students. First, I'd like to acknowledge that this work largely took place while I was at WSU in Pullman. So the project took place on the traditional lands of the Nez Perce or the Nimiipuu people. And as most of us know, heritage exists on the traditional lands of the Yakama Nation. I acknowledge their presence on their land since time immemorial and recognize their continuing connection to the land, to the water, and to their ancestors. And I would really like to encourage you to use this time that we have together to think about the ways that colonization has framed your teaching or our teaching as a whole, and how we can work to decolonize that knowledge in our teaching practices. Okay, so here's a little bit sort of where we're going. So I'm going to start by talking about what's the situation or what I consider the situation to be. What can open offer? And I'll talk a little bit about what open is because that's important too. What did the students do in this particular study that I'll be talking about? What did we find? And then how can we use this information to, I think, better our learning materials, better our teaching, and also get at this idea of decolonizing our teaching and our university. So that's sort of our pathway. So starting one, what's the situation? So in terms of student demographics, I want to note quickly that these do not match the demographics at Heritage, which we know are unique for a lot of different ways. But on a national scale, in terms of higher education, here's what we're looking at. So diversity in college student populations continues to grow, with nearly half of students as of a couple years ago identifying as people of color. There have also been increases in the percentages of poor and rural students, of LGBTQ students, of disabled students. So the university student population as a whole is getting much more diverse in a lot of different ways. And while these sheer numbers would suggest there's educational opportunity for all, and I just told you more diverse people are attending college, outcome gaps still persist. So while our students nationwide are getting more diverse, they're not achieving the same outcomes or have the same opportunities. So for instance, Black students have the highest college dropout rates and student loan burdens. Disabled students complete post-secondary degrees at lower rates than their abled peers. And first-generation students drop out at rates more than twice that of students with college-educated parents. So again, despite the fact that the student body that enters university is getting more diverse, that's not being seen sort of on the other end of the scale when we're looking at graduation rates, future success, etc. One hypothesized cause of this outcome gap is lower levels of belongingness on campus for marginalized students. So the research shows that having a sense of belonging to the educational community is a key factor in student retention for all types of students. So for all types of students, feeling like you belong both on your campus and within higher education as a whole is predictive of retention. For students of color, it's predictive of both student retention and of achievement. So their ability to actually succeed on their campus, not just necessarily stay there. We also know from the research that it's more difficult for marginalized students to feel like they belong in higher education. So one, we know that it's important for success and for retention, but we also know that marginalized students don't feel that sense of belongingness in higher education as much as their white continuing generation abled peers. So what can we do about this? So one possible way to increase students' sense of belonging is to diversify the educational materials that we're using in the classroom. So one way we can do this is to help students see themselves reflected in their classes. Now, one of the ways we do this is to increase the diversity of the professoriate, right, which we know is incredibly important. So students of color should be able to see themselves in their professors. But we also know that it's important that they see themselves reflected in the educational materials that we're using in the classroom. So in their textbooks, in videos we're showing them, it goes down to sort of as basic as the kinds of names that we use on exam questions or test prep questions or examples. So that kind of thing is one way at getting at this sense of belonging problem or conundrum for students of color. However, it's probably unsurprising to know that in many academic fields, upper-class white men dominate in textbooks. They dominate both in terms of who's writing textbooks, so they're overrepresented in terms of who writes the actual textbooks that are often used in classes. They're also overrepresented in terms of the images that we see in textbooks or the research that's discussed in textbooks. So for instance, research shows that diverse individuals tend to not be depicted as scientists. So even when they are shown in a textbook, they're not shown to be the sort of important people who are, giving us the knowledge of their research. We know that queer issues are underrepresented in history textbooks, if they're addressed at all, and they're othered in human sexuality texts. So it'll often be like a section at the end of a textbook of like, here's all the gay stuff, as opposed to being sort of woven in with the rest of the material. And we know that light-skinned individuals are overrepresented in medical textbooks, to the point that recently a Black medical student created his own dermatology textbook showing what skin conditions look like on darker skin, because a lot of people aren't trained to know that, right? If all of the images of something like a tick bite are shown on white skin, they don't know how to diagnose that on darker skin, right? So this is a massive problem where our textbooks do not appropriately represent either the state of our knowledge, but definitely don't appropriately represent the students who we now have sitting in our classrooms or sitting in their bedrooms on our Zoom screen. So here's the most recent report that I've seen that's actually quantified this. If you look at the upper bar, that is scientists in college biology textbooks in the 20th century, so 1900 to 1999. That red bar is white men. These are the people's research who's discussed. 9% women, 3% people of color. You'll note that they haven't even pulled out women of color, so it's not like we're looking at white men, white women, men of color, women of color, because the percentages for women of color are so low that they can't even be represented appropriately. That bottom bar is from 2000 to 2018. You see that some progress is being made, both for white women, presumably white women, and people of color. But you still see that 67% of the research that's discussed is research by white men, which does not reflect the amount of research being done. It just reflects what we've deemed as disciplines to be the most important of the research to discuss. So what can we do about this? This phenomenon also impacts students' career opportunities. So it's not just that, oh, well, we need to show some pictures of some people who look like them and we can move on. The Draw a Scientist study is a long-running longitudinal type study where you ask people of different ages to literally just draw a scientist. So say, draw a scientist, and then they code what that looks like across nearly all gender, age, socioeconomic, and racial and ethnic groups. The majority of people draw a white man. This has been changing over time, so fewer are drawing white men, and we see some more diversity, but it's still overwhelmingly the majority. We also see that this actually affects people's knowledge, so it doesn't just affect how they feel on their campus. For instance, girls who read chemistry textbooks that depict women scientists actually test better on that material than girls who read text excerpts where the images were of male scientists. So again, it's not just this sort of stuff that people might categorize as warm and fuzzy stuff, like, do they really need to belong? Like, we should just test them on the material and see how it goes. This is literally affecting how they're able to comprehend the material. People are better able to comprehend what they're learning when they're reflected in that material. So what can open offer in this sphere? So to sum up, I presented what I believe is a key problem where we know that retention and success rates for students of color are lower than for their white peers. We know that one hypothesized reason for this is that they don't feel like they belong on their campus or in higher education more broadly. And one possible cause of that is because the materials don't look like they do. So that's sort of the setup for where I'm going. Did someone have a question or comment? No, I thought I heard.
It's about your captioning function.
Oh.
We're just in awe of your captioning, Amy.
Oh,
that's all.
Get more volume.
What was that?
Sorry, Amy, just go ahead. We were just saying how cool your stuff was. Just keep talking. Never mind.
Keep talking. I don't have a problem with continuing to talk. Okay, so briefly, what is open? So when I talk about how open can help solve this problem, what do I actually mean? So many students report not buying a textbook because it's too expensive, with the vast majority of those students reporting that they knew that it would basically cause them problems, right? My guess is if we were to survey heritage students, this would probably be even higher just based on the demographics of our student population. So we know that students often can't afford their textbooks. They don't buy them even though they know that it's a problem for their academic performance. Open educational resources, or OER, are increasingly seen as a solution to this problem. OER are materials that are openly licensed. So that means their copyright license allows you to do things like share them freely, to modify them, to sort of pick and choose which chapters you're working with. And importantly, they're offered at no cost to students, right? So you often hear that latter part discussed when we're talking about OER, that they're free textbooks, and they are, and that's excellent. But that glosses over a little bit that openly licensed part, which is important to what I'm going to talk about today. This idea that we can basically edit the textbook depending on what our goals are for our classes. And just to sort of cut an argument off at the head here, and we can totally talk about this in Q&A later, but most research finds that OER either enhance student outcomes or don't change them. And importantly here in OER land, where I would place myself, not changing outcomes is perfectly fine. So not finding an effect of OER on performance is a perfectly acceptable outcome because you didn't make their educational experience worse and you saved them money, right? So in this world, as long as OER aren't making people perform worse in their classes, this is sort of what we're looking for. So most research finds that OER either enhance student outcomes or don't change them. And both students and faculty largely report positive perceptions of OER. So they're fairly easy to work with. Students enjoy reading them. So that's sort of setting the stage for what OER are, which is a weird combination of words. So the textbook problem. So this whitewashing of materials, and I'm using whitewashing pretty loosely because we're not just talking about ethnic or racial whitewashing, but whitewashing of materials can lead to a lack of student belongingness for marginalized students and a narrowing of their career prospects, right? I presented that argument in the beginning. However, despite its importance, so despite the fact that we know that there are these massive downstream impacts of something like whitewashing of textbooks, it's really difficult to modify textbooks, right? You get the textbook, you have students buy it, they get, you know, if they're buying it hard copy, they get a bound book and there it is. It's not like you can edit that. And even in the revision process, most traditional textbooks go through a closed revision process. So it's not like it's open to anyone who wants to contribute. People typically need to be invited to this process in order to contribute. And the people who tend to be invited tend to be some of, you know, sort of the bigwigs in a field or people who are more established, which we know tend to not be particularly diverse in a lot of fields. So this restrictive copyright license on commercial text doesn't allow for individual instructors to make modifications to the material. So even if you're reading through a textbook as an instructor and you're like, oh, I don't really agree with that, you can't really change it. I mean, you can tell students, okay, please don't pay attention to this page, but they're still going to read it if they're reading their textbook. They're still likely to interact with that, even if you don't want them to. So in this regard, for this particular problem, OER can offer a path to modification for instructors who are interested in effectively representing the diversity in their fields. Okay, so because they're openly licensed, they allow instructors on the individual level to say, you know what, I think we should have a picture of farm workers in this paragraph when we're talking about labor, as opposed to white people working, you know, in a tech company or something like that. So OER offer that option for instructors who want to represent effectively the diversity in their fields or of their students. Any instructor using OER can modify it to fit their local context, which I think is really important. So for instance, at WSU, when I was modifying OER, those textbooks, those end results probably would look different than when I do that at Heritage, right? Because Heritage students are different than WSU students, are different than YVCC students, are different than students who exist at Yale, right? So you can modify it to your local context and not necessarily rely on a textbook publisher to do that diversity work, because history shows that they won't. So this is one of the benefits that OER offer. So now I'm going to tell you how I actually approach this problem with one particular textbook, and then I'll show you some data for the scientists out there. So what did we do? I actually had students do this diversification process, which I think is important for a couple of reasons that I'll touch on at the end. But these were students in an introductory psychology class, which at WSU was about 110 students. And they completed this as a semester-long project. So it was part of their grade to edit their textbook throughout the semester. And I would be more than happy to send anyone any rubrics or instructions or documents, because I think this could work really well at Heritage too. But students had 5 steps in this project. So it was built to, also reflect some learning outcomes that I wanted for the class, things like annotated bibliographies and peer review. But it was really easy to embed in a course context. When they were actually working on the annotations, it looked something like this. So we had an electronic copy of the, let me get my pointer, of the textbook. It looks something like this. There's a tech tool totally free called Hypothesis. That's a free annotation tool that I used for this project. Again, I'd be happy to discuss those details. And students would go through and they would highlight the text. And for instance, here was a comment that a student made. It would be beneficial to add more about the impact of racism and generational trauma. This could even constitute another potential section to the chapter. This chapter could mention epigenetics and how previous generations' trauma can impact gene expression present day. Epigenetics can involve the altering of gene expression because of stress hormone changes. These changes are carried on into future generations of families, right? That's a student doing that work reading the textbook, saying, hey, something's not represented here. Let's add that into the textbook. Here's another example. This would be a good place to note that the percentage of racial and ethnic minority individuals receiving good quality treatment is even lower, right? So this textbook is talking about how 13.4% of adults received treatment for a mental health issue, which is low, right? Someone reading that is like, oh, wow, not a lot of people get help. But then the student is like, hey, it's even lower for racial and ethnic minority individuals. Why aren't we talking about this? So that's the kind of comment that students would make in the textbook. I then received a small grant, which was only really needed because of the size of my class at WSU. For typical heritage-sized class, I could have done that work on my own, but I paid some undergraduate project facilitators to sort through the comments because while I love students, not all 110 of them are going to provide comments that are worthy of inclusion to the textbook. So I had basically another round of review where students who were not in the class but had previously taken the class went through the comments and recommended the best of them for inclusion. Importantly, we used a local version of this text for our campus. So we had basically downloaded the main version of the textbook, which is available nationwide, is an OER, right? So we can do this. And we made modifications that were specific to our students. Again, not necessarily relying on the textbook publishers to do this because they won't. Separately, at the same time, I facilitated a project with OpenStax, which is, I think, the largest creator of OER nationwide, maybe worldwide, to also diversify the main text that was used nationwide. So I was doing this small level project with my students that had learning outcomes that I was pleased with for them, using their knowledge, while also tapping into my professional networks. So I put out a call to both teaching specific psychology groups and diversity, equity, inclusion focused special interest groups. And they were basically doing the same thing. So they were going through the textbook and recommending changes based on their professional interests or knowledge. Through that project, I collected 59 annotations, collected on 22 different sections of the book. So we've got these 59 annotations from professionals in the field. We've got another bunch of them from students in my class, all focused on making this textbook more representative of diverse students. So what did we find? Thankfully, we did not find that I wasted my time. So in terms of actually testing this study, so I took a separate group of WSU students who were not in my class, who did not know what the project had been, 422 of them, and they were given a set of readings on social psychology and sexual behavior. In the field of psychology, and specifically in an introductory psychology class, this is sort of an area or two areas where we can pretty easily collect diversity-focused work. So when we're talking about sexual behavior, there's a lot of gaps in terms of coverage of queer people, right? So that's an area where we can add a decent amount of diversity. The sample reflected the students at WSU, so predominantly women, predominantly white, and predominantly continuing generation. So they had parents who had earned a bachelor's degree. I think this is important and not necessarily a flaw here, because I'd argue that anything that we find in a sample that's maybe not as diverse as our students would actually be amplified in a more diverse sample. So if we can find the things that we found in a predominantly white, maybe not particularly poor sample, I think findings would be amplified in a more diverse sample. So I just want to note that. These students or participants were randomly assigned to either a standard condition, so the reading was directly from the original textbook that had not been modified, or a modified condition where their readings were supplemented by contributors who edited the book with diversity in mind. So both my students from the class, with permission from my students, or the professionals who had done the same sort of process. So we ended up with a couple of chapters that had been edited for multiple purposes. Participants then completed a set of questionnaires. So they were assessing the readings. So just a basic reading quality questionnaire. They were asked about a hypothetical instructor who might use these readings in their class. They were asked questions regarding their sense of belongingness on campus. And a questionnaire on their demographics. Okay. So what we found is that there were no differences between the texts on either ratings of the readings or the assessments of a hypothetical instructor using these texts. Again, in OER land, this is perfectly fine. The students didn't think the diversified textbooks were any worse or any better. Again, fine. And they weren't judgmental of a hypothetical instructor using these texts, because some of the feedback I was getting is that instructors were concerned about using more diversified texts because they thought that students in their class would think of those as being soft or as being less research minded. We didn't find that. Again, in this situation, no results, perfectly fine. We did find at WSU that underrepresented students report a lower sense of belonging because of their racial groups. It's probably not surprising. So over here, we just have a scale of 1 to 5. Our white students are in pink, underrepresented minority students in this navy color. Over here, you just have a bunch of statements about their feelings of belongingness. So based on their racial status, they said they thought they were taken less seriously by professors. They were less inclined to contribute to discussions in class, et cetera, et cetera. These just show that, unsurprisingly, at a predominantly white institution like WSU, underrepresented minority students don't feel as welcome and have a lower sense of belonging. So establishing that the problem that the research says exists broadly existed in this particular context. Our sort of core finding here is that first generation students in the standard condition, so reading the regular textbook, self-reported feeling less comfortable on campus, but this difference did not exist when they read the modified textbook. So over here, we've got our continuing generation students in teal, first generation students in blue. Reading the standard textbook, again, the textbook you'd get from the website or you pull off a shelf, we have a gap between the sense of belongingness for continuing generation and first generation students. That gap is ameliorated when they're reading the more diverse textbook. Again, this is just it's 2, not even full chapters of a textbook. It's not even exposure to the textbook throughout the whole semester. It's not exposure to the textbook while paired with thoughtful discussions or anything like that. It's just exposure to a brief set of chapters of a textbook, and we're able to ameliorate this difference here. Now, it's important to note that one of the things that is complicated about this at WSU is there's a large overlap between first generation students and students of color. So much like at Heritage, right, where a lot of our students of color are also our first generation students, that exists at WSU as well. So while this effect was found particularly in first generation students, I'm interested in following this up and trying to tease out whether this is a differential effect for first generation students versus students of color, but that overlap does exist there. So how do I think we can use this information to change our fields? So how do OER fit in with the Heritage mission? So I just demonstrated that there is an outcome that's important for the diversification of OER, right? That first generation students feel like they belong on campuses when they've read these diverse textbooks. So that's an outcome that's important. But I also believe there's something inherently powerful about the process of democratizing textbook creation, about saying it's not just one fancy important group of people who get to decide what counts as important. So the current state of commercial textbooks is such that a couple of pretty powerful people, right, powerful in terms of they're writing these textbooks, but also powerful in terms of the positions they sit at in universities and their degrees, they make decisions on what information is worthy of inclusions in the textbooks that thousands, if not hundreds of thousands or millions of students learn from, right? So some of the more popular, say, biology textbooks or intro soc textbooks, they're used by hundreds of universities across the nation, and millions of students read those. And we've just decided that a couple of people get to write those, and that's chill. Like, they just get to decide what's important. Put another way, influential textbook writers hold the power to curate knowledge for entire generations of learners, right? We have these textbooks that in some cases have been around for decades. Literally millions and millions of students have read that work, and they're deciding, one person or a small group of people is deciding what's important enough to count. Further, textbooks that are sold by commercial publishers will always be subject to the monetary interests of those publishers, right? Capitalism 101. So this provides an incentive to stick with the status quo, to not change anything. For instance, if you think about in high school textbooks, you often hear about the state of Texas brought up, right? Because Texas is the biggest buyer at the high school level of textbooks. And so textbook publishers at that level don't want to include information that would make it so Texas doesn't buy their books. And so they don't include correct information about things like slavery. Or why risk a discussion of things like queer education in sex ed if you know that that's going to cost you money, because states like Texas or rural school districts or fundamentalist instructors won't use your textbook, and that'll cost you money, right? So the way that it works right now, things don't change, because why would they? Because publishers want to make money. What OER does is it expands both textbook writing and editing opportunities. It serves to isolate the knowledge that we want to impart from this capitalistic structure where the people who are making money are also the ones who are deciding what's important. And it allows educators and students throughout the system to seize the means of textbook production, right? We can literally say we get to decide what counts as important. And I think this is the most important thing to think about, is that these modification projects, specifically the ones that are designed to happen within a class context, both implicitly and explicitly tell our students that their knowledge, that their stories, that their communities are important for our educational mission, and they're important for the work that we do. By telling a student, hey, you can create something that I'm going to use in my classes for the next 5 years, right? The example that you have about your father working in the fields, or the example you have about the stories your grandmother passed down to you, whatever we're talking about, we're telling students your knowledge is important and your knowledge is valuable. And we're really serving to separate the idea of knowledge from this idea of power and money. So what I think my 4 key takeaways are here. 1, we know that textbooks overwhelmingly feature rich, white, upper-class men, both textually and graphically. So in terms of the research that's represented or the stories that are represented and the images. And this has negative consequences for marginalized students. OER gives us options to change this phenomenon. So it sort of opens up the gate in ways that are very much closed when we're talking about commercial textbooks. There are many ways to use the resources we have to make these changes. So I hear from faculty all the time that I don't have the time to make those changes, right? And I totally get that. We're all scrambling. Make it part of your class, right? Sort of do these, get these learning outcomes that also get you a diverse textbook at the end of the day, right? So let your students help, tap into your colleagues, be creative. And when we make these changes, we can make a tangible difference for our marginalized students. So the findings that I showed, again, were just after brief exposure to 2 brief chapters. And we see that we were able to make some students feel more welcome on campus. Like, imagine what we can do if we're doing that in a context across a semester or across an entire undergraduate education, right? What kinds of things can we change for our students when we're doing that and we are invested in that? So my challenge to you, and this is sort of what I would like to, I think I've left a decent amount of time, for discussion and Q&A. So how are you going to use the democratizing power of open? And I use open really broadly because I mean it beyond just textbooks. But how are you going to use the democratizing power of open to help marginalized students see themselves in their classes, specifically in your classes? And yeah, that's what I got. I do have, I'll leave this up for a second because I do have a published paper that talks about some of the stuff that I talked about today, expands on it a lot, and I'd be happy to send you a copy. It is openly licensed, so you can find it for free. But that is what I have for you today. I'm going to stop sharing if I can press the button. There we go. Okay, that's what I've got.
So we are open for questions, and Ken might want to speak the comment that he had put in the chat box a while ago.
Yeah, amazing presentation. Thank you so much for that, Amy. And it echoes so many of the themes we teach our prospective principals about getting away from textbooks as the sole source of information in a classroom. Relia Cossett-Lent wrote a great book called Overcoming Textbook Fatigue that we talk to them about, and we do a module on all of the OERs, both on the OSPI website as well as the national clearinghouses for OERs that can be used not only for the kinds of learning you're talking about, making learning more relevant to our particular students, but I'm also thinking about how you can introduce a big idea or a concept to a student, and it could be around a diversity or equity issue or that sort of thing, and have them go out into the world and find resources that reflect that and pull that together as a curated collection of OERs. I think the big idea is, excuse me, as we talk about what we do in our curriculum alignment class from a leader standpoint, from a system standpoint, is like Covey says, you begin with the end in mind. And so in this particular course, in this particular unit, what are all of the outcomes and the gifts that we want to impart to our student? And then once we know what those things and those qualities are, then we can backward map all of those things that get us there, including and only then layer on instructional materials, and OERs are great to do that because they're so focused, they're so available, and there are a lot of folks out there that curate these things. So those are some of my thoughts. We are on board with you and preach to our principal candidates all about the importance of that.
Awesome. Yeah, one of the things that I really like doing is, so, I've done this as a textbook modification process. I've also done it as like a learning artifact thing. So I have students create some sort of study material that would help future students in the class, and they can decide whether or not they want to openly license them and put them online, or they don't have to, right? So a lot of this is also discussions about copyright law, which I think is important, but it's also sort of expanding what we consider important knowledge. So my capstone students this semester are doing a Wikipedia editing project, because I think a lot of students don't, and maybe faculty don't realize like what the process looks like for information literacy and information inclusion in Wikipedia. It's actually a great source, despite what a lot of our, or at least my high school teachers told us, right? And so beyond OER specifically, I think it can get to a lot of more broad information literacy and how information is processed both in academia, but also for the general public, which I think is incredibly important. Yeah, Mel.
I'm really glad I was able to catch this and get out of jury duty here. One of the things that I know you and I've talked about is, as I saw this come out, and I think many faculty here can attest to this, is that we start, it seems like every semester, with a pretty small percentage of undergraduate students that have their books in hand on the very first day of school. And I think if we could have a system that looked at having resources, some combination of this, where books and resources are included as part of financial aid, I just really think that would help with retention, and especially as you were speaking to already feeling, for first generation students, them already feeling disconnected. not having that book, not having those immediate resources, and sometimes it's not by fault of their own,
Right.
that they don't have those books. It's that their financial aid hasn't yet been completed or the aid hasn't been released. And so now in this current position of working with financial aid and understanding the financial aid process in more detail, I really believe this is possible and look forward to working with faculty on addressing this issue.
Yeah.
So there's a comment in the chat box from Veronica Howard. Veronica, would you like to speak your comment?
Yeah, Veronica.
Well, it was honestly just a reply to another comment that was in chat about concerns over compensation for open creators. And the other comment I think is important to highlight. The author said that they had concerns because they didn't understand how an open creator could be adequately compensated for their work.
Yeah, I think this is an incredibly important thing. And I think it's, you know, in my mind, it reads a little bit in some situations, like when we talk about replacing the GRE in, you know, graduate admissions. But when we talk about replacing it, we're replacing it with something else that's equally biased, just in a different way. I think we have the potential of doing that with OER if what we do is put the burden on a bunch of marginalized faculty to create diverse materials that they don't get paid for. Veronica's right in that publishing commercial textbooks isn't particularly lucrative unless you're one of the people publishing the textbook that makes or that's used by millions of students, which is very few of them. So it's not a steep decline. I think this speaks to the importance of things like advocating for these at the legislative level. For instance, the state of Washington actually has decent funding. It's concentrated a lot at the big state universities as well as the community colleges, but there are funds for faculty to create OER. And when the state looks at it at the sort of a bigger picture, the funds that we pay faculty to create those save the state a whole boatload of money in things like state level financial aid or at the federal level, because you know you create the textbook once and then it's free for anyone. So I created an OER for a critical thinking class as a graduate student, and it's been used at hundreds of places, both in the US and outside of the US. That was a one-time $4,000 grant from WSU. Just in WSU usage, it paid off tremendously. But if you think about the money that was saved at all the other institutions, it has got to be like 1,000 to 3,000 times payoff, right? And so I think this gets into things that Heritage as an institution versus at necessarily the individual faculty level could be advocating for, because there are ways for people to get compensated appropriately for their work. I think part of that is also involving students in the process. You know, like I said, I had funds to pay a couple of students to work on this with me, which was great. So I think it requires getting creative. I don't want it to be a situation where we replace student debt with faculty debt in terms of their time or resources or things like that. But I don't necessarily think it has to be. And I think there are ways to approach this that is equitable for all parties, except for textbook publishers.
Well, and also too, while the context here was about textbooks and your comments about how textbooks are written to serve the status quo are spot on, but remember too that OERs and things like that can be used for specific units of inquiry and topics and that sort of thing. So you could think big but start small by using OERs and getting students into developing OERs for specific parts of the outcomes and the content, and then perhaps that would build toward a whole textbook. But the key is that the textbook, by nobody's research, should ever be the sole source of information in a course.
Yeah, absolutely. There's, especially once you get out of, I think the introductory classes are pretty well represented for OER, that you can just sort of say, so in the similar way that we do commercial text, where we say, here's your textbook, ready, go, which again, for reasons Ken just said, I don't think is necessarily a good replacement either. But for the upper division classes I teach, it's a lot of, okay, here are a couple of chapters from this resource. Here's a video that fits really well for this resource, which takes a second more of prep time. but also means I'm only teaching the things I want to teach, right? I'm not having to go through a situation where I've got half a chapter where I don't actually need students to learn, but they're spending time learning it because it's in the textbook. And so they think I'm going to test them on it, even though I say I'm not. And so you're really teaching precisely towards your learning goals and not wasting time, either yours or the students. So I think, I talk about the textbooks in my class, but for people outside of my class, they probably don't actually look much like textbooks because it's really an amalgamation of a bunch of different resources. Yeah, Winona, I think that's an excellent consideration. And I think there's some ways that Heritage could be well poised to do some incredibly interesting and impactful things as a faculty unit. And again, at the state level, Washington is actually a fairly supportive state. And there's definitely some buy-in at the legislative level for these kind of efforts. And so I think there's definitely some thought to be put into that in terms of how to specifically leverage the skills that we have. But I think it's thought worth having.
Back in the day when I was on the Higher Education Coordinating Board, they gave grants for innovative things to various schools. And of course, that board has been renamed since then. But I wonder if there are funds at the state level that a school like Heritage could apply to.
Yeah, Mel.
Yeah, I just was curious about also if your research has led you into discovery about peer-reviewed research and access. I mean, much of the peer-reviewed research seems to be published under state and federal institutions, yet it's accessible only behind JSTORs or payable memberships. And I'm just curious if you ran into in your research access and how we create more open access. I realize going through a library, right? And if you have access to that, those, databases and stuff, but there still is a lot that's locked up behind these. You have to pay to play and read.
Yeah, there's a decent amount of that in all research fields. I think OER is better about it. So there tends to be more of it that's open. So for instance, the article that I noted at the end where these data are actually published is an open access journal. So totally open to anyone who wants to come across it. And I think the OER tends, again, to be better about that just because the people who tend to be doing that work are more focused on those kinds of equity issues. I think similar to OER, replacing traditional textbooks, we run into this issue where it's expensive for the authors to publish in open access journals. So there's a bit of a conundrum there. I think there's been a lot of movement, both generally, but especially in OER publications about doing things like preprints. So even if it's not the final published work, there are drafts available in various places online, or the researchers has posted them on ResearchGate, things like that. So it's not perfect compared to other areas that I've done research, because this wasn't like my dissertation or grad school work formally. So like compared to the stuff that I was doing in graduate school for my actual degree, it's eons better. So for the most part, I found I can get access to stuff without going through those paywalls in this particular field. I'm sure we have work to do, however, to get better. Oh, follow-up. You guys are signing me up for follow-up sessions.
I was thinking that possibly we could go to a "this is how you do it" workshop, and we could maybe draw in also Ann Kendall, so we could have a couple of you, because she has just gone through this process and redone English 350 to total open source patterns. So maybe Ken and you and Ann, and it would be the goal of that session would be, so you want to do this summer, how do you get started?
Yeah, and I think that, I talked a little bit about, talked a decent amount about creation or editing of materials, but the first step is finding materials that already exist, and there's a ton out there. They're just can sometimes be hard to access, and knowing the quirks of finding those kinds of resources. If we were able to do a workshop on how to find OER that already exist, I bet a lot of our classes could go OER quite quickly. And then we can get to the point of, okay, let's modify this textbook now that it exists and we've used it. The closed captioning, I promise, is just a button. Like, it's just a button on Google Slides.
I looked for that button and I can't find it.
Jim,
Okay, here, I'll go back to sharing screen. So this CC button right here, turn off captions, turn on captions.
Why doesn't mine have that? Okay, I'll look.
It might be a setting in somewhere in there. I'll look to see, maybe it's under, no, I'll find it later and I will shoot you an email. PowerPoint also has, so I find PowerPoints to be less accurate than Google Slides is. I'll send it to Mary and Mary can disperse to the listserv or something.
Okay.
So I want to thank you so much, Amy. This is such a rich presentation that we can move forward and work with. And I think a partnership between some of the early adopters and SILT. And I'd like to add Daniel to the picture as someone who can help us search out sources and processes for faculty to use to, as you said, to locate the resources that are out there, but sometimes may be difficult to find. So thanks for all the work that you've invested that we can help build on.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
So we maybe consider that the official end of recording. We still have a few minutes we can stay in the room.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer